Most people watching the news today see the conflict between Iran and Israel as just another political war, another struggle over power, territory, and influence in the Middle East. But what if that explanation is only part of the story? What if something deeper is happening beneath the surface of these events? Because throughout history, some conflicts between nations have carried dimensions that go beyond politics and military strategy. They reveal deeper tensions, deeper ideologies, and sometimes deeper spiritual realities that shape the decisions of leaders and the direction of entire regions. Listen carefully. There are moments in history when global events seem ordinary at first, but later generations look back and realize they marked the beginning of a much larger shift. Wars have a way of exposing the fragility of systems people once believed were stable. They shake economies, influence alliances, and awaken questions that many had ignored during calmer seasons. But for believers, moments like this also raise another question. Could there be a spiritual dimension unfolding behind the headlines? Because the Bible teaches that history is not merely a series of random events. Nations rise and fall, conflicts emerge, and decisions are made by leaders, but behind it all, there are deeper forces shaping the course of human history. In this teaching, we will explore why the Iran-Israel conflict may represent more than just a political confrontation, what believers must understand about the spiritual dimension of global events, and why moments like this require discernment rather than fear. To understand why moments like this deserve careful attention, we must first recognize that not every conflict between nations is driven only by politics or military strategy. Many wars throughout history have also been shaped by deeply rooted belief systems, historical narratives, and ideological convictions that influence how nations see themselves and their role in the world. When leaders make decisions, they are not acting in a vacuum. Their choices are often shaped by the history, identity, and worldview of the people they represent. The region where the conflict between Iran and Israel is unfolding has always carried extraordinary historical and spiritual significance. For thousands of years, this area has stood at the intersection of civilizations, religions, and competing visions of destiny. It is the birthplace of major faith traditions, the center of ancient empires, and a land whose history has shaped the spiritual imagination of billions of people across the world. Because of this unique position, tensions in this region rarely remain local. When conflict emerges there, the consequences often ripple across the global stage. Political alliances shift. Economic markets respond, diplomatic relationships become strained, and suddenly what appeared to be a regional dispute becomes a matter of international concern. But beyond these visible reactions lies another layer that believers should consider carefully. Nations are not only guided by economic interests or strategic calculations, they are also influenced by the ideas and beliefs that shape their identity. Leaders interpret events through the lens of their convictions about history, destiny, and purpose. And when those convictions carry religious or ideological significance, conflicts can take on a deeper intensity. This is why some observers notice that the tensions surrounding Israel often attract global attention in ways that seem disproportionate to the size of the nation itself. Israel is geographically small, yet its history, symbolism, and religious significance place it at the center of conversations that extend far beyond politics. Understanding this does not mean jumping to conclusions or embracing fear-driven speculation. Instead, it reminds us that believers are called to look at world events with discernment. Discernment allows us to recognize that global conflicts can carry layers of meaning that are not always obvious at first glance. And when we begin to see the world through this lens, we start asking a deeper question. If conflicts like the one between Iran and Israel are influenced by more than politics alone, what does Scripture reveal about the relationship between nations, conflict, and the spiritual dimension of history? To answer that question, we must look at how the Bible describes the relationship between the visible world and the spiritual realities that often operate behind it. Scripture consistently teaches that history is not shaped only by human decisions. While leaders make choices and nations pursue their interests, there is also a spiritual dimension influencing the course of events in ways that are not always immediately visible. One of the clearest examples appears in the book of Daniel. Daniel describes a moment when he had been praying and seeking understanding from God concerning the future of his people. The answer to his prayer did not come immediately. Later, when the message finally arrived, the angel explained something remarkable. The delay had not occurred because God ignored the prayer, but because there had been spiritual resistance connected to the affairs of nations. The passage reveals that behind political powers and earthly kingdoms, there can also be spiritual influences that shape events in ways people do not easily see. This insight introduces an important principle for believers. Not every event in history is merely the product of human ambition or political calculation. Sometimes the physical world reflects deeper struggles taking place in the spiritual realm. That does not mean every conflict should automatically be interpreted as a spiritual battle, but it reminds us that reality often has more layers than the headlines reveal. Jesus also spoke about seasons when the world would experience increasing tension among nations. In Matthew chapter 24, he described a time when nation would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. These words were not intended to create panic. Instead, they were meant to encourage awareness. They reminded believers that global unrest would sometimes appear as part of the broader unfolding of human history. When believers read passages like this, the goal is not to speculate recklessly about every political event. The goal is to develop discernment. Discernment allows believers to remain calm while still recognizing that the world is not simply a collection of random events unfolding without meaning. And this brings us back to the present moment. The tensions between Iran and Israel are being analyzed by political experts, military strategists, and economists around the world. Each of these perspectives helps explain part of what is happening. But believers are also invited to consider another perspective and the understanding that history sometimes carries spiritual implications that go beyond what analysts and commentators can fully explain. This perspective leads us to another important question. Why does Israel, a relatively small nation geographically, so often find itself at the center of global tension and international attention? Because when we begin to examine that question carefully, we start to see patterns that stretch far beyond ordinary political rivalry. When we begin to examine the place of Israel in global affairs, it quickly becomes clear that this nation occupies a unique position, unlike almost any other in the world. Geographically, Israel is small. In terms of land, size, and population, it is not among the largest or most powerful nations on earth. Yet, despite its size, it consistently remains at the center of international attention, diplomatic negotiations, and global debate. This reality often puzzles observers who try to explain it purely through political or economic analysis. Many nations experience conflicts or regional tensions, yet few receive the same level of sustained global focus. Israel, however, has remained a focal point of international discussion for decades. Decisions made within its borders frequently draw reactions from governments, religious communities, and political movements across the entire world. Part of the reason lies in the extraordinary historical and spiritual significance attached to this land. For thousands of years, the region has been associated with events and narratives that shape the faith of billions of people. It is the setting for many of the most influential stories found in the Bible. For Jewish communities, it represents a homeland deeply tied to identity and history. For Christians, it is connected to the life and ministry of Jesus. For Muslims, it also carries religious significance connected to sacred traditions. Because of this layered significance, events in this region often carry symbolic weight that goes far beyond ordinary geopolitics. Conflicts there are not only viewed through political lenses, but also through historical and religious narratives that influence how people interpret what is happening. There is also another factor that increases the intensity of attention surrounding Israel. The Middle East itself has long been one of the most strategically important regions in the world. Energy resources, trade routes, and alliances among regional powers all contribute to the complexity of the political landscape. When tensions rise in this region, global markets react, diplomatic relationships shift, and the entire international community begins to pay closer attention. But for believers, there is also a deeper dimension to consider. The Bible frequently describes Israel as playing a significant role within the broader narrative of history. This does not mean that every modern political development should automatically be interpreted as a direct fulfillment of prophecy. However, it does remind believers that the story of Israel has always carried spiritual significance within the biblical narrative. Because of this, conflicts involving Israel sometimes stir strong reactions among people who see these events through the lens of faith as well as politics. Some interpret them cautiously as part of larger historical patterns, while others view them as reminders that history is moving toward outcomes that God ultimately oversees. Understanding this does not require fear or speculation. Instead, it calls for thoughtful discernment. Believers are invited to observe global events with awareness, recognizing that political conflicts may sometimes intersect with deeper spiritual narratives that have been unfolding for centuries. And when we begin to understand this intersection between politics, history, and spiritual meaning, we start to recognize another important principle. Moments of global tension often reveal deeper realities about the world system itself. They remind us that the structures people trust can be shaken more easily than many expect. This leads us to an important insight that believers must understand. When conflicts like the Iran-Israel situation begin to intensify, because beyond the immediate political implications, such moments can also reveal spiritual realities about the fragility of the systems people rely on every day. And this is where we must begin to understand something deeper about moments like the one the world is witnessing today. Conflicts between nations do not only affect the countries involved, they often reveal how fragile the systems of the world truly are. When tensions escalate between powerful nations or influential regions, the ripple effects spread far beyond the battlefield. Markets begin to react, alliances shift, energy supplies become uncertain, political leaders begin making rapid decisions in response to changing circumstances. What once seemed stable can suddenly appear fragile, and people around the world begin to feel the pressure through rising costs, economic uncertainty, and growing anxiety about the future. But believers must look at these moments differently. Because throughout history, seasons of global shaking have often exposed an important truth. The systems of this world are never as permanent as people assume. Empires rise, systems grow strong, and societies become comfortable believing that the structures supporting their way of life will always remain the same. Yet history repeatedly shows that change can arrive suddenly and reshape entire generations. This does not mean the world is collapsing, but it does remind us that human systems are temporary, political alliances shift, economic models evolve, global power balances change over time. And when these changes occur, they often reveal how much people have placed their confidence in systems that cannot guarantee permanent stability. This is why believers are called to develop a different perspective. Our confidence should never rest entirely on political stability, economic systems, or international alliances. Those things will always change. Instead, believers are encouraged to build their lives on foundations that remain stable even when the world around them becomes uncertain. But here is where the teaching becomes even more important. Whenever the world enters seasons of tension and uncertainty, something very interesting begins to happen among people. These seasons begin to separate individuals into two different groups. And the difference between these groups is not determined by wealth, nationality, or education. It is determined by mindset. There are those who respond to global shaking with fear. Every headline creates anxiety. Every conflict deepens uncertainty. These individuals feel overwhelmed because they assume the systems around them would always remain stable. But then there are those who respond differently. Instead of panic, they respond with discernment. Instead of fear, they seek understanding. They recognize that history moves in seasons and that moments of tension often reveal opportunities for wisdom and preparation. And this leads us to an important question every believer must ask. If conflicts like the one between Iran and Israel reveal deeper spiritual realities and expose the fragility of the world system, what should believers actually understand about moments like this? Because when you study scripture carefully, you will discover that the Bible often reveals principles that help believers navigate seasons of global uncertainty with clarity rather than confusion. And understanding these principles can completely change how someone responds when the world begins to shake. Now, listen carefully, because this is where the teaching becomes very important. When global conflicts begin to intensify and the world appears increasingly uncertain, there are certain spiritual realities believers must understand. These realities help us interpret what we are seeing with wisdom instead of reacting with fear. Because if you only look at events from the surface level, you may miss the deeper lessons that seasons like this are meant to reveal. The first reality believers must understand is that not every battle is only physical. Throughout scripture, we are reminded that the visible world is not the only dimension influencing human history. Decisions made by leaders, movements of nations, and the rise and fall of empires can sometimes reflect deeper ideological and spiritual forces shaping how people see the world. This does not mean that every conflict is purely spiritual in nature, but it does remind believers that reality is often more complex than what appears on the surface. The second reality is that nations are often driven by belief systems. Every nation carries a story about who they are, where they came from, and what destiny they believe they are pursuing. These narratives influence how societies interpret threats, alliances, and conflicts. When belief systems become deeply intertwined with national identity, disagreements between nations can become more intense because they are no longer simply about territory or policy. They are also about identity and conviction. The third reality is that moments of global tension reveal the fragility of the world system. Many people assume that the structures supporting the global economy, international diplomacy, and political stability are permanent. But history repeatedly shows that these systems can shift quickly when pressure increases. Conflicts between nations can disrupt supply chains, influence markets, and create ripple effects that reach far beyond the region where the conflict began. The fourth reality is that global shaking often awakens spiritual questions. When the world feels stable, many people rarely stop to reflect on deeper questions about life, purpose, or faith. But when uncertainty appears, people begin searching for meaning. They begin asking questions about the direction of the world and the role faith might play in helping them understand what is happening. The fifth reality, and perhaps the most important for believers, is that discernment must replace panic. When global events create uncertainty, fear can easily spread through societies. But believers are called to respond differently. Instead of allowing fear to control their thinking, they are encouraged to seek wisdom, prayer, and spiritual clarity. Discernment does not mean claiming to know every detail about the future. Rather, it means recognizing that history unfolds in patterns and that moments of tension can reveal opportunities for spiritual awareness. It means remaining calm while others panic and seeking understanding, while others react emotionally. But there is an even deeper insight hidden within seasons like this, and understanding it can completely change how someone views moments of global conflict. Because whenever the world experiences significant shaking, something remarkable always happens among people. Because whenever the world experiences significant shaking, something remarkable always begins to happen among people. Seasons of tension and uncertainty tend to separate individuals into two very different groups. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history, and understanding it can completely change how someone views moments of global conflict. The first group is the group that responds with fear. When they see wars, rising tensions, and uncertainty in the world, anxiety begins to take control of their thinking. Every new headline increases their worry. Every development feels like a signal that everything is falling apart. because their confidence was built primarily on the stability of the world around them. When that stability begins to shake, they feel as though the ground beneath them is disappearing. But there is another group of people who respond very differently. This second group does not ignore the seriousness of global events. They understand that conflicts between nations can have real consequences. However, instead of allowing fear to dominate their thinking, they respond with discernment and wisdom. They recognize that history has always moved through seasons of calm and seasons of tension. They understand that the world system has never been permanently stable. And because they understand this, they approach moments of global uncertainty with a different mindset. Instead of panic, they begin asking deeper questions. What can be learned from this season? What adjustments should be made in response to changing circumstances? How should believers position themselves spiritually when the world begins to feel uncertain? If you study the scriptures carefully, you will notice that many of the people who navigated difficult seasons successfully were not those who ignored warning signs. They were those who understood the season early and responded with wisdom. Consider the story of Joseph in Egypt. Joseph received the revelation that 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of famine. Now imagine the reaction of someone who ignored that warning. During the years of abundance, they would continue living as though prosperity would last forever. They would consume everything without planning for the future. But Joseph understood something powerful. He understood that seasons change. Because of that understanding, he implemented a strategy. During the years of abundance, resources were stored. Preparation became a priority. Systems were organized so that when the famine arrived, Egypt was not overwhelmed in the same way other nations were. Another example appears in the life of Isaac. The Bible tells us that Isaac sowed during a time of famine and received a 100-fold harvest. That passage reveals something extraordinary. Difficult seasons do not eliminate opportunity. In many cases, they reveal opportunities that were hidden during more comfortable times. But the people who recognize those opportunities are rarely those who live carelessly. They are those who live with wisdom, discipline, and spiritual awareness. And this is why understanding moments like the current tensions between Iran and Israel is so important. Because beyond the political analysis and military strategies, these events remind believers that the world system is constantly shifting. And when those shifts occur, the difference between fear and stability often comes down to one thing: preparation guided by discernment. Now the question becomes very practical. If conflicts like the one between Iran and Israel remind us that the world system can shift quickly, what should believers actually do in moments like this? How should we respond when the headlines are filled with tension, uncertainty, and speculation about what may happen next? The first response must always be spiritual stability. One of the greatest dangers during seasons of global tension is allowing fear to control your thinking. Fear spreads quickly in uncertain times. People begin to imagine worst-case scenarios, and the constant flow of alarming news can make the future appear darker than it truly is. But believers are called to guard their hearts and minds carefully. Spiritual stability comes from maintaining a consistent relationship with God through prayer, reflection, and faith. When a person is spiritually grounded, they are less likely to be shaken by every new development. The second response is discernment. Discernment means learning to observe events thoughtfully rather than reacting emotionally. Not every dramatic headline represents the full picture of what is happening in the world. Discernment allows believers to step back, seek wisdom, and evaluate information carefully before forming conclusions. It helps people avoid falling into the trap of fear-driven speculation. The third response is wisdom in how we live our daily lives. Global conflicts can sometimes influence economies, markets, and opportunities in ways people do not immediately expect. This is why believers are encouraged to live with discipline and foresight. Building financial wisdom, developing valuable skills, and avoiding unnecessary dependence on unstable systems can help individuals remain steady even if the global environment becomes more uncertain. The fourth response is prayer for peace and wisdom among leaders. Conflicts between nations are complex and often involve decisions that affect millions of lives. While individuals may feel powerless watching events unfold, prayer remains a meaningful way for believers to respond. Praying for peace, wisdom, and restraint among leaders reflects a desire for stability and compassion in a world that often struggles with division. The fifth response is perspective. It is important to remember that history has always contained seasons of conflict. The world has passed through wars, tensions, and crises before, and yet life continued, societies adapted, and new opportunities emerged. Understanding this helps believers avoid the temptation to see every conflict as the end of everything familiar. Perspective reminds us that while global events may appear overwhelming, they are still part of a much larger story unfolding across generations. And believers are invited to live within that story with faith, wisdom, and courage rather than fear. When these responses become part of a person's life, something powerful begins to happen. Instead of being overwhelmed by uncertainty, they become anchored, they remain calm while others panic. They remain thoughtful while others react impulsively, and over time, this stability becomes one of the most valuable qualities a person can possess in a world that often feels unpredictable. And this brings us to a final and very important truth that believers must remember. In seasons like this, moments of global tension are not meant to drive people into fear. They are meant to awaken discernment. Throughout history, whenever the world experienced shaking, it often reminded people that the systems they trusted were never meant to be the ultimate foundation of their security. Political alliances can change, economic systems can shift, nations can rise and fall. But the deeper message for believers has always been the same. Do not place your ultimate confidence in systems that are constantly changing. Instead, build your life on foundations that remain steady even when the world around you becomes uncertain. This is why Scripture repeatedly encourages believers to live with wisdom, faith, and preparation. Faith provides peace in the midst of uncertainty. Wisdom provides the discipline needed to navigate changing seasons, and preparation ensures that when difficult moments arise, individuals are not caught completely off guard. The tensions between Iran and Israel may continue to evolve, and analysts around the world will continue to debate their political and strategic implications. But for believers, moments like this serve as reminders of something deeper. They remind us that history often moves in ways people do not expect, and that discernment is one of the most valuable qualities a person can develop. Discernment allows you to observe events without becoming overwhelmed by them. It allows you to remain thoughtful while others react emotionally. And most importantly, it helps you remember that no matter how uncertain the world may appear, God is never surprised by the unfolding of history. So instead of responding to global events with fear, choose to respond with wisdom. Strengthen your spiritual foundation. Seek understanding rather than speculation. Build your life on principles that remain stable, even when circumstances change. And if this message has helped you see the world with greater clarity, right? I choose discernment.